So good afternoon, and thank you very much for joining us in this panel discussion. My name is Paula da Costa, and I'm really sorry for my voice, but it's not my responsibility, it's Lithuania's responsibility. And thank you again for being here after a long day. I will be the moderator for the session, and we will talk about the unseen war, fighting corruption in emergency situations. We'll talk about the multilateral development bank's approaches in crisis situation. So the panelists with whom we will discuss, starting here with Mr. John Versen-Voort from the Asian Development Bank, then with Mrs. Monique Koning from the European Investment Bank, Marco Serletti from the Inter-American Development Bank, and last but not least, Alan Bacaresi from the World Bank. I would like to say that crisis and conflict-affected environments, be it humanitarian, pandemic, natural disasters, or man-made conflicts, have common features. They are risky for the people who live there. They are risky for their governments. They are risky for the neighbor countries. And they are risky situations also for those who seek to provide aid. Today, nearly a quarter of the world population lives in a fragile or conflict-affected context or area, driven by crisis, including armed conflict, forced displacement, food insecurity, and climate change. So fighting corruption requires both a prevention approach and also a curative approach. And this is what we are going to discuss here on the perspective of the multilateral development banks. But before we commence, I will kindly ask the panelists to do a brief introduction about themselves and their organization. You will be provided with the time to ask questions, make comments, or share experiences. Thank you very much, and I will ask John from the Asian Development Bank to do a brief introduction. We start by alphabetical order, by the way. Asian Development Bank, to you the floor. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Paula. And you see there's no favoritism on this panel. It's all very objective standards that we maintain here. Asian Development Bank is one of the various multilateral development banks that are represented at the panel today. We have operations all the way from the Caucasus region in the west side of Asia to the Pacific Islands. We finance public sector projects. That's actually a majority of the funding that we do, as well as private sector operations. The topic is very relevant to us because of the size of financing that we provide, as well as the challenges that we face in the region. Last year, Asian Development Bank financed $23 billion worth of projects. And we generated additional $16 billion in co-financing resources. So to the tune of $40 billion, and that's some serious money. Public resources that we need to protect against abuse, make sure that the money gets used for intended purposes and intended beneficiaries. With the recent reforms that MDBs are doing and undertaking to strengthen their capital base, we're going to have an additional $10 billion a year for the next decade. So $50 billion a year is serious enough money for us to be very vigilant about how we're using that. Apart from the global challenges that everybody is familiar with, such as the pandemic and the occasional financial crisis that we have to fight off, the Asia-Pacific region is actually very vulnerable to emergencies. The region is perhaps most prone to natural disasters compared to many of the other continents. We have the Ring of Fire that maybe some of you will have heard about in the Asia-Pacific region, leading to lots of volcanic activity, earthquakes, and then, of course, with the huge Pacific Ocean continuing to warm, lots of tropical storms leading to lots of vulnerability and emergencies in the area. The Asia-Pacific region is probably also one of the regions most vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change. We have 16 small island development states among our members, many of whom are obviously at risk of elevated sea levels and the many storms that I referred to. And in the Asia-Pacific region, about 2 billion people live in coastal regions, again, vulnerable to rising sea levels and other adverse effects of climate change. And then in addition to the 16 small island development states, we have a number of countries that are affected by conflict and instability, notably Myanmar and Afghanistan, which are also important areas of operation for the bank. And if we look at fragile countries and the small island development states together, in our portfolio over the last 5 years, on average, 10% of our operations are financed there. So $5 billion annually in very high-risk areas make it extremely relevant for us to know what we're doing in emergency situations. So this is why today's panel, I really appreciate the opportunity to speak here today.
Thank you very much, John. And I will now allow Monique Koning from the European Investment Bank to provide a brief introduction about the organization, about yourself.
Thank you very much, Paula. So, the European Investment Bank, brief background, is owned by its 27 member states. It operates both in the European Union, but also outside. About 10% of our annual lending is outside the European Union. We have, with an emphasis on the east, on the south of the Union, but then also in Africa. And obviously, Ukraine is a very big topic at the moment for the EIB, talking about emergencies. But I think we'll come back to that later. More than 50% of our lending is on climate-related projects, but the other 50% is also Paris-aligned, so we don't finance fossil fuel projects. But we do a lot of work, for instance, in renewable energy and new technologies. We have a heavy emphasis on innovation, on digitalization, on sustainable cities, urban transportation, and on SME lending. Another thing that I can say is, why is this topic relevant to us? We're not, by tradition, emergency lenders. I have a background in conflict-affected countries development and worked in many different conflict-affected countries, but in the EIB, our projects are normally, well prepared, very thorough, rather slow, one could say. And of course, when an emergency arises, one has to be prepared. For instance, the COVID period, we developed a very comprehensive program within the European Union to address COVID. And what is emergency? It means that you have to disburse very, very fast. You have to enhance your lending, you have to disburse fast, and yet, of course, you have to maintain your zero tolerance policies. You mentioned it, and of course we also have it. So zero tolerance to fraud and corruption, and that sometimes, of course, then poses different challenges. So where we come in is indeed we work in the European context, which means that all what we do also in the investigation side or the complaints mechanism side, which I also head up, and the evaluation side. It's the three are the accountability functions of the EIB. And accountability meaning that we have to show to our board that, and our stakeholders, that the money is well used and is spent for intended purposes, and we get the maximum output for the buck. So that's in a nutshell what I do as Inspector General in the EIB. Yeah, so we have indeed, on going back to the investigations, we focus both on internal fraud, corruption, prohibited conduct, and misconduct, as well as outside the prohibited conduct that happens in our operations. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Monique, for this introduction. And I will pass the floor to Marco Serletti from the Inter-American Development Bank.
Thank you, Paula. Yes, well, my name is Marco Cerletti. I'm the head of investigations of the Office of Institutional Integrity of the Inter-American Development Bank. The Inter-American Development Bank is a multilateral development bank in the same way that John and Monique have described their own institution. Our focus is on the Latin American and Caribbean region. That's the main difference. The shareholders of the institutions are most of the countries in the region and developed countries that contribute as, not donors, but contribute to the mission, the United States, many European countries, Korea, Japan. So I'm not going to repeat what my colleagues have said. We have a similar mission. We have a similar lending structure. That means we also lend both to public sector and private sector. The lending goes to different areas of development, but basically it's health, social development, infrastructure. And now recently there's a big push, of course, for address climate change. Similar to what, for instance, John was describing, our institution also is in the process of enhancing and increasing the lending capacity, which means in the next years, especially right now with the private sector arm, which is IDB Invest, but also eventually with the public sector lending, there will be an increase of money and with a particular focus on climate change. And similar to what Monique was explaining, for us, this topic is relevant because in our region, we also face sometimes emergency situations. From natural disasters, we have situations of flooding, like recently in the southern Brazil, or earthquakes, Haiti, also wildfires. We're having to have this crisis with climate change in the southern cone. And in terms of conflict, we have, maybe that's not right now the main topic in terms of the traditional either civil war or situations like that used to happen more often in Latin America than happen not so often now, but where we are facing a new form of challenging, let's say, the established order, which is criminal activity, criminal gangs, basically, that sometimes became so powerful in certain countries in a region that they start controlling even factually geographical areas in certain countries and making it very difficult to operate. So that's a new challenge. That's something that we have not seen before. So basically, those events usually make very difficult two things. On the one hand, the mission itself of the institution, delivering in those places the goods, the works, the things that are necessary, but also when something goes wrong, the accountability. Our office, the Office of Institutional Integrity in the AfDB, is the office that enforces the integrity framework, and in a way the anti-corruption office of the AfDB. And it's very important, as Monique was saying, our institutions work under a premise of zero tolerance to fraud and corruption. But when all these challenges combine, sometimes just, and we will talk a little bit about this later, just to being able to enforce those rules becomes very complicated, and that's why it's so relevant for us.
Thank you very much, Marco. And now I will allow Monsieur Baccarese from the World Bank to do his introduction.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I Paula, have the benefit of most of you probably having heard on the introductory panel. Now, where are we? Wednesday. So yesterday, yes, I'm losing track of days at the moment with the jet lag. So our Vice President Mohamedou Diane, who's in the audience, spoke already very eloquently about the work that we do. He set out the vision of what the World Bank is trying to achieve in terms of poverty reduction, obviously, in terms of building international partnerships, et cetera, and all that feeds into very much the work that we do. But as you set the stage for me, I just wanted to speak a little bit more about the work that we do within the Integrity Vice Presidency. And forgive me, I've never been one for acronyms, but having arrived in the World Bank 3 years ago, that's all that we learn is acronyms. And as you start to understand what they are, they then change them. So it's a continuous repetitive process, but the one I do know is INT, and that's short for integrity, and that's even our colleagues across the rest of the world know us as INT. So it's a curiosity in many ways, because I am not an economist. I don't have a political sciences background, although plenty of exposure to corrupt politicians. I'm not quite sure that qualifies me. The World Bank is well known for having the most PhD owners in any international institution in the world. I don't, and most of my team actually, I don't believe, are really PhD holders either. So I'm a former prosecutor from the United Kingdom, which gives you some idea of the direction in which INT is heading. And as the Director of Investigations, Strategy and Operations, I sort of lead the INT team in a couple of crucial respects, and it's an important necessity for an MDB to have the sorts of functions that are represented here. All of you will know, and certainly I know that you'll having shared this experience as well, we're not always the most welcome people in the room. We have awkward messages to deliver on risk. But again, that gives you a little bit of flavor of the work that we do, because we are a barometer for risk tolerance within these institutions. And the World Bank obviously is the World Bank, so by definition we cover the entire planet. So everything that my colleagues have told you about in terms of numbers and scales, it's probably 3 or 4 times by necessity, obviously, and by design. Just in terms of numbers very quickly, FY22, the World Bank made commitments of 115 billion, which was a 5% increase on the previous year. And again, with the other support of the international community, and particularly in responses to the current emergency situations that we're facing, both in terms of climate, in terms of Ukraine, and in terms of many other emergency situations. The lending and the financial instruments across the World Bank continues to increase, and there is a commitment with a brand new president who's just, I think, completed his first anniversary in the bank to speed up, and I think it's the point that you made, Monique, about improving the speed at which the projects are designed and disbursements and implementation takes place. And with that comes risk. And this is our domain. This is what we do. We're synonymous, INT in particular is synonymous with some very, very large investigations. Many of you will know the investigations against Siemens and the 100 million program of work that they undertook as part of the settlement. And that's well known, I think, in the international community. But investigations is only part of what we do in addressing risk and helping the bank to both understand risk and also to sort of set appropriate mitigation measures in place. The one thing one of my managers always says to me is that if this game was easy, Citibank would be doing it. And of course, Citibank don't have that tolerance. Citibank are not going to go to Mogadishu. They're not going to go to South Sudan. They're not going to go to many of the places that my colleagues have referred to. So this is the value of the MDBs, I think, is that we have a variable risk tolerance to support development. And that's why I came. That's my passion, having left as a criminal prosecutor, then engaged with civil society, having spent a long time in Africa working on criminal investigations against powerful politicians and prosecutions. This, to me, was the place to deliver ultimately impact, with the combination of both the ability to look at integrity from almost a quasi-law enforcement perspective, but also supporting this passionate agenda of poverty reduction and development that we all ascribe to. So very briefly, and we'll return to this particularly with the example that I have, INT's focus is on risk. It's about investigations, but it's not just about investigations. We also have a team that works on the prevention aspects of the work. We have data scientists, we have an internal investigation function, which actually just looks at staff and vendors of the bank who are involved in allegations of fraud and corruption. The sexual harassment, bullying, issues like that is dealt with by a separate part of the bank. So our focus is really very much on fraud and corruption, which means that we recruit people from that type of background, investigators, former police officers, prosecutors like myself, but also some very other interesting people who come from varied backgrounds to support these areas. And why is this important? And I think what we've tried to do in the last few years, certainly since the Vice President and I have been working in INT, is to really sort of shift the focus, not away from investigations, but actually to make them sharper, more focused, more intelligence-led, responding to risk, particularly in the changing environment that we see now internationally, and to actually have the prevention team part and parcel from the inception of our complaint mechanism, and so that they see the risk that everybody else across INT is seeing, to then assemble that risk and then to use it as potential mitigation in real time with operations, which I think is a very significant departure. And that then builds a different level of trust with other people across the operations, across the bank, the World Bank, particularly around operations, which is where we need to mitigate that risk. And just by way of very quick numbers, this year, we're coming to the end of our financial year, we had about 4,500 allegations of fraud and corruption. We have about 120 active investigations. Somebody cut me off.
I think your time is...
Just two more figures.
Okay.
We have about 80, 90 active complaints under development. And obviously in terms of the prevention sort of interventions, there are many, many across all jurisdictions in the other world. So before I get cut off again, I'll stop at that
I
point.
didn't cut you off. So thank you very much, Alan. As you can see, we have very passionate colleagues here, but now we need to go into our subject. Prevention in anti-corruption is about knowing your customer, knowing your client, due diligence. So now I'm going to ask John, in the prevention work that the Asian Development Bank undertakes, the function is to advise integrity, risk identification and management, which includes also everything that is related with reputational risk. So the question is, how is your office organization acting to prevent integrity challenges and risks in the situations that we are referring to, conflicted, affected environments or emergency, where there are emergency crises? If you can share examples and lessons learned, but please, you have 7 minutes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Very strict. Yeah, when you're dealing in emergency situations in developing countries, you're dealing with probably the highest risk situations in the highest risk environments. And that's probably why the men on this panel are also follically challenged. So in an emergency situation, you know, there's, as Monique said, there's a huge pressure for disbursement, quick decision making. And often what you also see is that the attention to typical controls actually starts to wane. So there's a shift of even sometimes actual human and budgetary resources away from the typical control functions towards, you know, getting things done. You're dealing with large volumes, sometimes in a context that we haven't dealt with before. I think the vaccination program that ADB financed from 2020 onwards, $9 billion in a sector, frankly, that we had to learn as we were going. We hadn't been dealing with the vaccination programs in our countries. And then huge logistics and coordination challenges with blurred boundaries in terms of responsibilities. What is the public sector doing? What's the private sector doing? What are some of the civil society organizations doing? And that context is actually, you know, makes it very important to really focus on a sound prevention and risk mitigation strategy. Now, the biggest one of the biggest assets that I think we have and that is in place and that we maintain during emergency situations is the general deterrent effect of our sanctions regime. Because of the zero tolerance to fraud and corruption, and we will pursue every credible complaint of fraud and corruption, and it doesn't matter whether that's in an emergency situation or in a regular project, we treat it all the same. And that regime has been tested over time. The MDBs have actually joined forces from the 2000s onwards, having a uniform approaches with respect to our investigations, with respect to the kind of sanctions that we mete out when we do find fraud or corrupt. And we actually recognize each other's debarment decisions, provided that certain parameters are met. And that's hugely important because it has both a specific deterrent effect to the actors that we're dealing with, as a general deterrent effect for those that are, you know, wanting to participate in MDB financed procurement, including in emergency situations. The next thing that is very important is integrity due diligence, especially when we're dealing with private sector entities. We are very aware of making sure that we deal with the right people. When it comes to our own governments, we don't choose. We don't choose our clients. We have to work with the governments that we have. But when it comes to dealing with the private sector, we do robust integrity due diligence, make sure that we understand who we're dealing with, whether they have a track record, especially, again, in the time of the vaccine, at the time of the pandemic. We saw a lot of new entities entering into this area, and we were really trying to weed out and make sense of who is having actual capacity to deliver versus who is just starting up and hoping to cash in on a quick buck. So integrity due diligence, when there's red flags because of adverse media or because of it's not clear who are the beneficial owners of a particular entity, we do enhanced integrity due diligence. And if that doesn't give us the comfort to deal with the party, we just avoid dealing with them. Where we see risks, but we feel that we have no choice but to act with the party, we focus on mitigation. And an important aspect of mitigation is, of course, making sure that we have proper governance, proper sort of contractual obligations that not only make clear what standards of integrity we expect from the counterparty, but also provide us with the right to audit and inspect records and understand what was delivered at what price and whether it met the necessary standards. With respect to new areas such as we dealt with in the pandemic, maintaining quality standards was very important to us. There was huge pressure in, I don't know if you all remember this still, in the early days when vaccines were coming out, but people didn't quite know which ones were actually good enough and which one were not. There was huge pressure on us to have vaccines that were sort of preliminarily approved, to have these financed by AdB, or to have vaccines that were already approved by themselves, but where the production facilities were just starting up and hadn't been vetted yet, to have these financed by AdB. And we resisted that. We wanted to make sure that we were in this area that we were not familiar with, that we dealt with vaccines and with facilities that had been vetted by the World Health Organization or the other bodies that were sort of authorized to have an opinion on that. We were dealing during the pandemic with entities that had never heard of us, and we had never heard of them. And for them, many of them, it was the first time to deal with the financing of a multilateral development bank and having to deal with the anti-corruption and integrity covenants. And they said, we don't accept that. They didn't want to be subject to the kind of scrutiny that we require. But again, notwithstanding a lot of pressure to the contrary, I think it was very important that we were able to, I think as MDB community, with a harmonized position on this, is that we do not waive our investigative rights. We want to make sure that our standards are followed. And many of the vaccine suppliers did accept them, and those that didn't, we didn't finance. And it was interesting that actually, anecdotally, I did hear that some of them actually decided not to do it because they were under pressure by governments to pay money and make facilitation payments and bribes. So it was very important that we held the line on these anti-corruption and integrity provisions in the contracts and the inspection rights. A third element that's very important in emergency situations, especially when you cannot do all the advanced risk mitigation that you would normally like to do, is what we call proactive integrity reviews. Rather than waiting for a complaint about something that has gone wrong, we sometimes, we choose selected projects and we go in and just check ourselves whether processes were followed. We did that, for instance, in the Philippines. We did a proactive integrity review on the AFEX projects that we did about the delivery of emergency supplies, just to make sure that we were comfortable that what was required on paper, what we required in our financing documentation, that those standards were actually being followed during implementation of the emergency project. Then finally, just one word about fragile and conflict-affected situations. I briefly mentioned Myanmar and Afghanistan. Because of the political situation there, ADB does not engage with the de facto governments there. We don't recognize these governments. But there are humanitarian needs in these countries. So what we have done there is, rather than dealing with those de facto governments to deliver basic social services, we have contracted with UN agencies on the ground. They are the ones that are implementing the project. We only disperse to UN agencies. We don't disperse to the de facto governments in those countries. And to the extent that disbursements are made by UN agencies to third parties, we make sure that there is screening of those parties to make sure that there is nobody on the UN Security Council list or otherwise an unacceptable counterparty to the Asian Development Bank. And very important in the context of Afghanistan, for instance, we do not accept the informal money transfer arrangements that are quite common there in the Hawal system. So let me stop there. These are some of the prevention and risk mitigation strategies that we observe.
Thank you very much, John, for keeping the time. Monique, on fragile and crisis environments are often the ones that need the most financial support, not only for immediate response, but also for rebuilding and recovery. But we need to make sure that these funds do not feed more fraud and corruption to ensure sustainable and inclusive development. The same question that I asked John for you at EIB.
Thank you. Thank you, Paula. Yeah, sure. I'll cut my response in two pieces. First, I'll talk a little bit about how the EIB addresses the fraud prevention side. And I just want to say that Michael Bushell is in the audience, and he's the chief investigator. He heads up the division that deals with all aspects of fraud and corruption, both on the preventative side and the actual investigation side. So in general terms, what do we do on the prevention side? It's always, it's easier said than done. It's always better to prevent, but nevertheless, this is a challenge in and of itself. We have two, I would say, to start, we have a team dealing with prevention, and what we have is they have developed over time two rather sophisticated tools that are digital tools. They are driven by artificial intelligence. And one is focusing on procurement, so it's the corruption risk in procurement tool. And the other one is the fraud and integrity risk scoring tool first. So CRIP, the procurement tool, actually, what it does, it can highlight risks in procurement of bank finance project. What it does, it takes an enormous amount of big data from the EU's public procurement database, and it analyzes that in terms of 10 different risk profiles. For instance, when there is a lot of like closed procurement or restricted procurement or very fast procurement procedures. So all of those elements can highlight a certain risk in the procurement, and then we can match that with our own counterparts that are involved in our project. So this is how, and then we flag it to our procurement office, and then they can then take a more close scrutiny on the procurement that's taking place in a project. So that is one element. And then we have the first, which is the risk scoring tool, where we have 50 different criteria which are focused on KYC, on country risk, obviously, KYC, industry risk, the involvement of PEPs in operations, but also external. We use Transparency International database and information as well to feed first. And out of that, we can identify those operations, those projects, where we think that there's a heightened risk for fraud and corruption. Then we can do a desktop analysis. So we take a set of high-risk projects, and we analyze them further. And from that, we can then distill our proactive integrity review. Just as John has mentioned, we also have that tool where we actually then go into a project. We visit the project, we ask for the documents, we have contractual visit rights and disclosure rights, and we analyze the risks. Sometimes, you know, when we have, for instance, an intermediated lending financial institution, we look at the financial institution itself, but also at the projects that were financed by that institution. So we look at the end users. We did one in Bosnia and Herzegovina a couple of years ago, which really came to quite interesting results, which then the learning is, well, there is a risk of fraud and corruption. We need to enhance our due diligence and look, you know, more closely into our, for instance, our intermediated operations in certain high-risk countries. We did one, a proactive integrity review not so long ago on external offices. So we have external offices. We have 60 external offices, and a lot of them are outside the union, scattered around the world. And so we also scrutinized their processes and procedures, and there also then some feedback from that learning in how to enhance our processes and procedures. So the important thing of proactive integrity reviews is also it always channels back into what can we learn from this and how can we do it better. So that's on the general side. Now, zooming into, indeed, to conflict and emergency, Ukraine. So, as you can imagine, the EIB is under huge pressure, and not only the EIB, World Bank, EBRD, others are as well, to speed up our disbursement in Ukraine and to do more in Ukraine. We have 55 projects approved for 7 billion. We play an important role in implementing also the EU's monies that it made available for Ukraine. So we got a portion of that we have to implement. And we are involved in a number of sectors. So we do indeed sort of an emergency restoration, municipal lending, we do energy, we do transportation, restoration, physical restoration of schools, etc. So we're involved in a number of areas. Of course, access to these areas is sometimes difficult, and our local boots on the ground are also limited. So all of this, you know, I mean, already in a war situation in Ukraine, you cannot expect issues to, especially fraud and corruption, to get any easier in such an environment. Law enforcement is weak, capacity is weak. The fraud and anti-corruption agencies in Ukraine, they need a lot of help, and they really have a really daunting challenge in Ukraine. Now, what do we do, therefore, so we have some streamlined emergency procurement processes that we put in place with, I think the World Bank and EBRD are involved in that. And at the same time, we have increased our due diligence and our monitoring on the ground to make sure that everything goes according to plan. We have technical assistance where we educate, where we try to give training to local consultants and local people to familiarize them with our procurement rules to make sure that they also do the right thing. We work, for instance, on municipal projects with UNDP, who actually is really our agent in terms of preparing, implementing those operations. And that can give, you know, also intelligence of what goes wrong, what is going right in terms of fraud and corruption. So it's an important intelligence for us as well to see what's happening in Ukraine. So, and then we have the e-procurement system, which, of course, the Ukrainians have put up an e-procurement system that needs to be strengthened. And that can give a lot of transparency and also a much more orderly sort of procurement process, and so that is also work that we're all doing together with the donor community and the UN agencies to make sure that that functions well. So that's still work in progress, I think. Now, coming back to the investigation side, since the environment is so difficult, we believe that it's of critical importance that we work together with the World Bank, with the EBRD, with bilateral donors on the ground. And we have given, for instance, we have that cooperation, and we do exchange information, and we coordinate our work in Ukraine. We have done a joint training, I think, for anti-corruption agents in Ukraine as well. So that is of critical importance. And we work very closely with, of course, the Ukrainians themselves. So we have 2 MOUs, one with NABU, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine, which we signed recently. And then we also have one with the SBU, the Economic Security Bureau, and we work closely also with the State Bureau of Investigations and the General Prosecutor's Office. So all of that, I think, tries to, all of that cooperation and trying to transfer knowledge also to these anti-corruption agencies, trying to make sure that they get stronger, because eventually they have to do it, right? They have to make sure that things happen properly in the country. All of that, we believe, is going to help to prevent also corruption, fraud in Ukraine in our operations.
Thank you very much, Monique. You have 3 minutes more than John, so I will see to balance, because I don't want to be accused of favoritism. Okay, Marco, when things go wrong, we then have to investigate, which is the function, I would say, that integrity and anti-corruption offices are the most known for. Although we do a very important work in prevention, as you have heard, with John and Monique, but we also need to ensure accountability. So in terms of the investigation, what is the approach in crisis situation where there are de facto governments? Can you share any concrete examples? Thank you.
Thank you, Paula. Well, yes, indeed. What happens when something goes wrong? Now, all the effort that we put in prevent things usually is very useful. It increases the quality or at least the institutional chances that things are delivered, but still things can go wrong. Then there's a part of the mechanism which is basically investigating and try to find liability for those who engage in what we call prohibited practices. Basically, what is an investigation is finding what happened and finding the evidence to support what happened. That's the main challenge of every investigation. And that is a challenge in itself already. Now, to answer these 2 questions, to do these 2 things usually is challenging. What is the problem with in conflict situation areas in emergency? Well, that because usually for logistic reasons, both things, getting to know what's going on, getting to know what's happening, getting to get people to talk and tell us this is, in context again, when already the help is being deployed, already we are delivering, we're trying to deploy projects, get deliverables, get works done, etc. How do we know what's going on? So that's one, because of logistics, because there are travel restrictions, because there are no presence of institutions on the, our own institutions sometimes, or any institution on the field. So how do we know what's going on? And even when we heard or we have an idea about what allegedly is going on, how can we get the evidence to then make someone liable because of that? These are the main challenges. There's not one single problem. No, sometimes the emergencies create, it's a conflict. So in a conflict situation, then the challenges are one. Sometimes it's just an emergency because it was a natural disaster. So the problem is that in a particular moment, in a particular time, the presence of the state in that region is diminished, but it's not permanent. It's not going to be there forever. Or what happened in the pandemic, for instance, where the problem was that nobody could travel around the world, but in many countries, in many specific places, there were different rules on how to handle the pandemic. So the first thing is The concrete answer to an investigative challenge depends on what is the emergency or what is the situation that is causing the problem. So in some instances, for instance, when, and this is a pandemic example, when in the pandemic there was a period of time that nobody could leave our home, so that there was nothing you can do. But at certain moments, in certain countries, they started lifting restrictions. There were still things that are starting to happen. People were going back to work, but travel restrictions remain. So we, as an office, couldn't go to that place. But that didn't mean that people on the ground, people, locals, they could actually work. They could actually conduct inspections. So that was solved by simply outsourcing. It's not as simple, but what I mean is that was an easy solution. If you want, okay, we cannot do the work, but we will hire someone on the ground who will be able to move. We cannot go there, but they can do it. Under our guidance, technology has improved. So, for instance, we can start conducting remote interviews. So, even with the help of the locals, we can get people to talk to us. And that was a change, and that was something that allowed us to do. Before the pandemic, all this idea was not so prevalent. That was a solution. But this outsourcing is not always possible. Sometimes when you have a situation of conflict, like in civil war or internal conflict, nobody can go to a certain region. Nobody can go to certain places. We are not going to hire a private investigator to go there. We cannot do that. So in those situations, our usual resource, if available, is partnerships. Partnership with other international organizations, with other people who are on the ground. Now, multilateral development banks for security reasons, because of the nature of our organizations, we will not keep usually emergency task force or anything in certain areas because of security reasons. But the UN, because of its own nature, sometimes certain agents in the UN will be the last ones leaving some place. And so through partnerships, sometimes we can work together with the UN and have them maybe serve to set us in touch with someone or to corroborate some specific factual finding, etc. We can partner with them and they will help us. The challenges, again, in investigations in terms of evidence is preserving evidence and then being able to access the evidence. And what I'm saying this because one of the challenges that happen sometimes in crisis is that there is documentation or there are witnesses to something, but the evidence is not preserved. The crisis, if it's a flood, it's a situation of conflict, somebody will say, well, the building was burned, so the documents are not there anymore. So sometimes we can prevent this. Again, if someone is still there, we can ask some UN agency, can you hold these documents until we have access? So it can come from simple arrangement like this, like working together and ensuring that we can preserve, okay, can you just write down the number of certain people before they might be displaced? It depends, again, of the challenge of the evidence we want to preserve. And then, of course, eventually it's access, and that sometimes happens later. But then that's the second line that we would try in terms of partnerships, work with agencies, international agencies, bilateral agencies, that remain on the field. And when all this happens, sometimes, and we need to be very careful, very mindful of this, sometimes what helps is civil society. I'm not talking about necessarily organized civil society, which also sometimes they have the same constraints and the same problems and the same situations, if not more. But sometimes what it takes, and we would never ask, by the way, anyone from civil society or any individual to do an investigative activity for organizations. But sometimes what we need is just someone who points us to what's going on, what can be the problem. And a concrete example is something that we did once in a context of, there was not a civil war, but there was basically a remote area. One of these places when the governments usually don't have a lot of access. There are people living there, but there's not a lot of presence of the state. However, there was a project that was supposed to deliver certain goods and certain support for local communities. And we started receiving allegations that either that support was not being provided or people were being charged or abused. In order to get that support, they were being asked things that were not supposed to us. And what ended up being very useful for us in this particular story was we somehow, miraculously, managed to get access to not even a community leader, was a person very active within the community. And the funny thing about this is it was a community where there was only one landline. There was only one line of phone landline in a place where, in the local, let's say, grocery store, which covered the whole region. So this community leader, or community member, the one that we managed to establish some contact, and the one that was telling us that, that all this is happening, the beneficiaries are not getting anything, or they're in charge. And she would basically go around the area, and we are talking about villages that were 5 kilometers distant from each other. She would go around the area, and she would tell people, look, there's someone who wants to help us. Would you willing to? Yes, to tell the story, yes, I would like. Okay, be on Friday, 2 p.m. in the grocery store. And then for 4 or 5 weeks, every Friday, 2 p.m., we will call this number, and we will talk to this person, and this person will tell, well, I brought 3 today, and then they will come and tell us the story of what's happening. Then the next Friday, we got 4 more, and then next Friday. So little by little, we managed to gather in phone interviews evidence of 15 different beneficiaries telling us different stories about how the implementing agency that was supposed to be delivering there not only wasn't delivering, was giving less than they were supposed to receive, were charging them or imposing them products they didn't want, that we later find out were related to the head of the unit who actually had a factory of that. So he was interested. So this is an example of something. In this case, basically, the investigation was possible. Eventually, we managed to go to the country. We even brought the people to the capital and talked to them in person. But this was initially possible, knowing what's going on and figure out who was who, which is possible because there was one person going village by village and saying, would you like to talk to Friday, 2 p.m.? I remember that, Friday, 2 p.m., because it was the same time zone that we were. So this is an example. Now, this is an anecdotal example. This is even generates a lot of sympathy, but we cannot do this in certain contexts. When there's really a security concern, when there are people are really in danger of dying, when people are afraid, we would never ask someone to be 2 p.m. in a place and to talk to us, because that's not. So this is some of the ways we're trying to circumvent the limitation of not being able to go to the place or not being able to know what's going on, that the government or our institution is there, that the UN is not there. So how can we know what's going on? How can we find these things? And just to make a little bit, I'd address another topic and also to keep it in time.
You are already 4 minutes ahead.
Okay.
So it's okay because I will deduct it from your hand for your conclusion.
But I
will not deduct it from my own time. Please conclude.
I was jumping. The other issue is now the use of technology. There's a lot of hype in the use of technology. It's true, technology has evolved. It has a lot of things, but sometimes it's overhyped. This fantasy that with technology we can do everything. But indeed, there are some things that with the use of technology we can do. And from some use of satellite images, something, and Alan, I know that he would now walk us through an example of that. Or sometimes, it's funny enough, we live in a strange world when sometimes people will be in a place where they don't have access to basic needs. They might not have access to food, they might not have access to water, but someone will have a smartphone, for whatever the reason. And they can go and sometimes take a picture of something that later we can use to know what's going on, and they can record things that 20 years ago when I started this, there was no smartphone. I started working in this area, in this international organization in 2004, and the iPhone was launched in 2007. So this was a fantasy, and right now, you find out. So there are some uses of technology that help. They are not as revolutionary, or I always want to walk away from this fantasy of with technology we will do everything. No, there still is a lot of things that happen on the field. But technology evolves a lot, and there's a lot of noise, but there's a lot of real things happening. You need to be alert, you need to be updated, because there are things there that can be useful, and just because of all the noise, we might be missing an opportunity. And with that, I think I can.
Thank you very much, Marco.
I'm 4 minutes down.
So you are 4 minutes down, Alan. So Alan, the list of the fragile and conflicted affected situations at the World Bank is released annually. Is your approach applied, the approach to investigating these situations, is this list used to adapt the investigations in situations of crisis in de facto governments? Can you give us a concrete example?
Yes, I'm happy to give you an example just to sort of illustrate some of the points that have been made. I mean, there are a lot of really important instruments that the bank produces that, in terms of just the enormity of the data, it's important. For us, the important thing is to complement that with the intelligence that comes from the huge amount of complaints. And with 4,500 allegations a year, that's a lot of intelligence. That's not to say that all of those are investigated. But all of that information is used. So we, as I said already, we have data scientists and analysts doing a lot of synthesis and analysis on that data, and that's feeding back into the risk. So it's a complement in addition to a lot of the materials that we've heard about and you've alluded to. And just before I start, it's so interesting to hear my colleagues speak in uniformity around the language that we use across the MDBs. It's interesting that we come from different perspectives, different contexts, different continents for that matter, and yet the harmonization that's gone on in the last 20 years, which is really the time that these functions have been evolving, is we've reached a really interesting position now where we speak almost in unity when we talk about the sanctions, the offences, the definitions, and also the private sector work that sort of follows some of the other departments. So it's really interesting to sort of hear the, the significant harmonisation that's gone on, which requires work. I mean, that requires a significant lift. I'll follow on from where Marco left off. I agree with him in terms of the vulnerability of some of the witnesses that we have. I think that's exacerbated in FCV environments. Not only is there risk exacerbated in these environments, you also see very significant abuses of power as well. People where there is no rule of law or where it's collapsing or has collapsed will step up and really sort of assert the sorts of pressures and the misconduct that comes naturally, unfortunately, to some of these people. So you have a perfect storm with FCV environments, which makes the investigation challenging. And Marco's already alluded to some of the cases and some of the techniques, because being in country, as high as the appetite risk amongst my investigators is, there are just simply some jurisdictions we cannot go to. And so the ability to use on-the-ground people, I slightly disagree with him about the technology, but we can speak about that maybe during the question session around proactive investigations in particular and how the technology is really changing the way that we work. So you can see all these exaggerations, and they really present a very significant challenge to us. So I wanted to sort of give a very concrete example from Afghanistan. I think Monique sort of alluded to. No, it might have been John actually. John mentioned Afghanistan. That was an FCV environment, which then became an FCV environment. Yes.
FCB environment?
FCV, sorry, fragile conflict and violent jurisdiction. I think you referred to it as...
Yes, I did.
So there we're not harmonised.
It was just...
Largely we are harmonised.
It was just to repeat.
But the fragile, as I said, I now speak in acronyms, which I've never done in my entire life. So fragile conflict and violence afflicted jurisdictions. I think Mohamedou mentioned it when he was speaking on the plenary session, that increasingly we're seeing potentially up to 50% of the world's population now slipping into this particular unfortunate sort of category of life. So, as I say, Afghanistan was already, back in 2016, when our example started, an FCV environment. On August the 21st, when the government collapsed and the international forces pulled out, it became FCV times 10. It became even more difficult as a jurisdiction in which to do work. But the example I wanted to give was just an indication of some of the work that we do, some of the techniques and some of the creative, innovative techniques that we've just been exposed to, sort of starts to give you some sort of an insight onto what's going on here. Here we actually successfully substantiated allegations against a very significant Asian company. I won't tell you where the countries are. This is still going within our sanctions system, but I thought it really sort of touched the other point. And just to give the audience a bit of a sort of a graphic example. So this is a project to renovate the Hindu Kush road in Afghanistan. And as most of you, if you know your history, you know that much of it was built by the Russians during their military occupation to actually transfer military hardware to try and defeat the Afghan people. That was unsuccessful. It did then provide a lifeline to those very exposed communities living very high up in very difficult sort of environments. And it's interesting that roads, just the creation in terms of development of building roads, the positive impact it has on development, access to markets, access to schooling, access to education, particularly for young girls. It does sometimes have the unfortunate also side impacts, as this project did, of potential environmental and social safeguards issues, because there are obviously areas where you have to acquire new land, and obviously we have the whole ESG, which is the environmental social safeguards issue to bear in mind. But this is pure fraud and corruption. This is an Asian company that came in. The project dates back, as I say, to 2015, when the World Bank committed to spending 150 million, that's to across a very substantial project, to renovate the Trans-Hindu Kush Road in Afghanistan. 150 million. It became effective as a project in January 2016. And this particular company successfully bid for 2 procurements, 2 lots, to renovate 87 kilometers of the road, and then a further 152 kilometers unpaved road. By the time the Russians had left, I mean, there was practically nothing left of the road, so it's an entire renovation. So this company misrepresented its qualifications, which is already a fraudulent incident for us, and that is enough already to sanction them. But it gets worse, and this is an indication of the sorts of issues that you face in FCV environments. So they were successful on 2 separate bids, both of them multi-million US dollar programs. They bid successfully in their own right. They are usually expected to declare whether they have any other companies assisting them, particularly in terms of delegation of any of the road construction or even constructions of bridges here. What happened was that the allegations then started to come in from a particularly exposed individual that this particular company had been colluded with government officials. And it's something we hear on a fairly regular basis. The issue is to try and find out exactly what and to what effect. They had been very clever, very cunning, actually, in colluding with government officials, not simply to hand over the awards, but to actually eliminate much of the other bidders in the process. So rather than take the risk of paying bribes, which there may be an element of this, they simply had conversations to actually eliminate the other competition. So that took place by certain conversations. Public officials would visit the other companies, would threaten them with blacklisting. This is at the request of the Asian company. And they were told that basically, unless they withdrew their bids, because they saw that they were very competitive, that they would be blacklisted and would never work in Afghanistan again. Now, some of these are local companies as well, so the risk to them was enormous. So they complied. Very clever is that the Asian company then, once they knew that through their collusive relationship with the government officials, including a former minister of state who came to one of the other meetings to broker the conversation between the 2 companies, the Asian company was successful in the 2 bids and then engaged the company that had been threatened to actually deliver 100% of the contract. Which is really quite a stunning feat of deceit, fraud, collusion, corruption, bribery,
Amazing.
You name it. I mean, it's absolutely staggering. What is true, and we see this across many of the projects that we do, is that what follows usually, almost invariably, is terrible implementation. And that's exactly what happened here, because the margins that had been left by the Asian company taking a very significant chunk of that money, even though it never intended to do any of the work, it meant that the local company was under incredible pressure to try and deliver. Well, invariably, it means that the road is not done properly, that they cut corners, and consequently, it becomes, and particularly in such a high mountainous area, it becomes a very, very dangerous road to actually travel on. And that's exactly what the investigators established. By the time that we'd fully understood what the complexity of the corrupt and fraudulent scheme was, including high-level public officials, the teams on the ground, and we've done a lot of preparatory work actually going back into the prevention aspects here. The trust fund that was funding this also provided some ancillary money for the country unit. We had a country unit at the time in Kabul to actually employ ANT investigators and also some of our forensic auditors to do some of the work that John was referring to. And so now that we had greater visibility on the project, we then started to fully understand what the consequences were. So we then began a process of reevaluating what the project was. We worked obviously closely with our colleagues, and then the withdrawal from Kabul happened. So that was the 15th of August of 2021, which meant that our investigators who had been able to go into the jurisdiction could no longer now do so. So now I come back to one of the points that Marco made very tellingly, is that there are sometimes people on the ground who have that local context. And this was a former Afghan individual who'd worked for the UN previously and acted as a consultant. So ensuring that he was safe, that he was not taking any undue risk, he then actually went up into the mountains and took the photographs, which I could have presented today, but unless you're a road engineer, you probably would not see the nuanced problems that you had. But essentially, they discovered that in places the road was too steep. It had not been built at the right angles. Critically, there were a number of posts on the particularly exposed areas where there were horrendous drops into the valley below. So they had safety features which were actually concrete posts. They were never installed. They weren't even installed badly. They just never bothered to actually install these important sort of safety features. The road was flat in places where it should have had a camber to actually to wash away a lot of the water. So effectively, the road, almost as soon as it was made, started to degrade. And about 60–70% of what was actually built, obviously the project was stopped in August 2021, was actually not fit for purpose. And so this is the investigation that began. We had to rely...
We will need to conclude to allow the audience to ask questions.
Of course. And, well, just to sort of conclude, so this gives you some idea of the difficulty of operating in these environments, the risk, not to just our investigators, but also more importantly, I think in many ways, actually just those people who are brave enough to sort of step forwards. And the duty of care there, I think, is always important. Where I do agree with you, Marco, is that AI and all these very creative solutions, which we'll touch upon shortly, are an answer to some of the challenges we have. But ultimately, investigations are always about people and about what people can tell you. And that's the critical feature here. So this company now, these companies are under sanction. They will be, it will be made public in due course when they finish through the sanction system. And the public officials, we now hope, may be placed under sort of criminal investigation for the collusive, corrupt role that they played in the contract. So just a quick example of some of the...
Thank you very much for the example.
Okay.
Sorry, I think I have to have a little bit of water because my voice is really going away. So thank you very much for the very concrete examples, both in prevention and investigation. I think now the floor is yours. So if you have a question, comment, please, Mike. So we have there first, second, third. We'll go here and then there. Please ask your question and indicate as to whom are you asking the question.
Yeah, my name is Ghassan. I'm from Palestine. I'm working my work is in the management on funding consortiums of a humanitarian and emergency program, so I'm not anti-corruption expert. We say that during emergency, it's a situation when more people become, of course, more suffering, stagnation, and vulnerability. But at the same time, it's a situation for many who become rich or much richer. So, and from this list, from our experience, we have vendors, border police, shipping agents, some pharmaceuticals who monopolize procurement, nice procurement regulations, and favored consultants, and etc. And talking about UN and multilateral agencies, they are doing their best, but they suffer from, they don't say they suffer, but that's what we perceive, that they get excessive funding pipelines, even much beyond their capacities. They manage, in this case, they manage the funding quickly. To respect political wishes. They manage it through third party, and that's why a lot of money are wasted in the road of second tier, third tier, and fourth tier. And etc. So my question is, when do you come in a situation when multilateral agencies believe that they have to do their own, to investigate their own capacities to make sure that they are unintentionally, for sure, unintentionally, that they are contributing to an environment of increased risk of corruption? Thank you.
Did you get the question?
Yeah.
So, sorry. So your question was directed to which panelist?
The question is to the World Bank. Yeah,
World Bank.
World Bank.
To the World
And
Bank.
any other from the respected panelists. Thank you.
Yes, I'm not sure. I mean, I'm looking at John and colleagues here, whether I've fully understood the entirety of the question. I mean, certainly what you've described is very familiar territory to us. You're describing, those involved in the processes who become richer and richer. You gave examples of favoured consultants. These are many of the allegations that we get. And certainly for us, our mandate is broad. Anybody who touches any of World Bank financing, and I know it's true of my colleagues here, is subject to the jurisdiction of our investigations. The example there are the public officials who are sometimes often part of the implementation unit. Sometimes they receive World Bank financing, which you may be surprised to learn that they can earn both a public salary and be financed by the World Bank. But that's a problem because as soon as we know that they're financed, we do have jurisdiction over them as well. And we do investigate in those rare circumstances the public officials as well. But that is the demand side is the gap here. And that is something I think we can discuss in a little bit more detail because this is the area that we now need to more creatively sort of target and support national institutions. But what you describe is familiar territory to us. There is always somebody who gains, or often many people who gain from these processes. Our skill sets for what they are is to understand what the processes are, to understand the risk, to undertake the investigations, using the audit clauses that John referred to look at what the process has been and who's benefited. But we don't just stop there. I mean, we have the ability to sort of follow the money effectively. In fact, we're having a conversation with one of the countries present here today about finances from one of our projects that have come through one of the Baltic states. And we're determined to follow that money and, if necessary, to interview and place the bank under investigation. So the trail is long. I mean, anybody who touches that money effectively can be subject to the jurisdiction. Now, if I fully understood the question, the other aspect of this, which I think touches upon what you're saying, is the national institutions themselves. And we have an obligation. It is our fiduciary obligation. It's the way that the World Bank and others were created, that we have a responsibility to ensure that all taxpayers' money and donors' monies are spent appropriately. So we take our job very seriously. Added to that is the other side of the coin, which is the investigation capacity and expertise of the jurisdictions themselves. And you can imagine there are some jurisdictions where the rule of law is very, very low, incredibly fragile. The FCV environments are the obvious example. There are other examples and other jurisdictions who are very open to supporting us and working with us. We refer some of our investigation materials to some of those agencies, and they can undertake the criminal investigations themselves. But we're always cognizant that there are many jurisdictions where the national authorities need that support. And if you heard the comments on the Open Day panel, you'll know that was one of the indicators, one of the platforms going forwards is as we continue to learn from this work, as we continue to share our experience and lessons learnt, is to then try and support many of the other national authorities. And actually our colleagues, I see one of our colleagues from the governance practices here, and that is very much their domain, but often supported by us because of the experience that we have emanating from investigations. So John, I don't know if you wanted to add to that, but I think that was
I think part of the question is also, do we understand our own limitations, right? And I think I'll go back to a comment that Alan made at the beginning is, we go places where other financiers will not go. And if we don't do it, nobody will possibly step up to do it. So for us, it's high-risk activity in high-risk areas. But I think as a public development institution, we have obligations to understand, to try and understand what we're getting into. But we have to get into, and I'm sure mistakes are being made along the way. And if I look at the vaccine projects that I was referring to, sometimes exorbitant prices were being charged, but that was what was available in the market at that time. And people, undoubtedly, also protective equipment, etc. Some people became filthy rich along the way. But, that was what was available at the time that we could provide for our countries. And that's, the market is broken at the moment like that. But this is what we needed to do.
Thank you, John. Sorry, I will just ask if is anybody in the audience that has a question for the European Investment Bank, for Monique in the panel, because she will have to leave in a few minutes. Any question for the European Investment Bank? We are okay? So next question here. Please indicate if you have a question or you are doing a comment or a contribution, please.
I got a question.
Thank you very much.
I got a question.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thanks to the panelists for your wisdom, your operational and pragmatic wisdom from your experience. I'm Andrea De Tommaso, Senior Consultant for Rosacco Group. We provide audit, investigation, compliance, and oversight services in the humanitarian and development field. And I have a question for Mr. Selletti from the Inter-American Development Bank, since he addressed the question that all of us as investigators ask ourselves from the very beginning of our cases, that is, how do we get the evidence? How do we get the evidence? And will I be able to get the evidence when I'm in the country where I'm supposed to conduct my mission, to lead my investigation? And I think that this topic is connected to another big topic, which is the topic of privileges and immunities. I asked myself, I was reasoning about this topic in those typical lonely nights during the in-country missions, while you experience the legal challenges of some delicate context, notably in my case in Latin America. That's why your words resonated a little bit in my mind. So my question is, and let's say a consideration, is that an area of interest that would be worth further analysis is the topic of mandates, authorities and immunities of MDBs to conduct investigation and sanction. That is, are investigations an extension of a commercial activity tied to the lending instruments and contracts, or are they akin to those enjoyed by a sovereign, in which case they should be protected from litigation in courts and must be dealt with in the context of independent MDB systems? I think that this is a hot issue because this, as far as I know, this has been an evolving topic being challenged in court. And another consideration might be how or should law enforcement, I'm a former law enforcement senior officer, engage with or collaborate with MDBs, with MDB investigative offices as they would with other law enforcement agencies or administrative investigative agencies, because we might say that views on this might vary from country to country. So thank you for answering these questions. And again, thank you for your pragmatic and wise words in this occasion. Thank you.
Well,
I'll help up with the last one.
Thank you.
Thank you. How many days do I have?
12 minutes. Let me just sit there.
You have 12 seconds.
12 seconds. No, well, I think there are two questions. One, I would ask the first one. Maybe just, it's a very specific topic, actually, and that touches in particular my institution, because the Inter-American Development Bank was, in fact, challenged in court in the United States as a result of an investigation. So people investigated by the IDB went and complained to a judge saying, no, this investigation is improper, it was poorly conducted, and by the way, the US federal system has jurisdiction because this is an extension of a commercial activity. So there was a topic of a legal debate in the United States. And there's a similar precedent, not on this line, but also that challenged the privileged immunities of the World Bank, in this case in Canada, for a different reason. But there have been indeed some challenges to the privileged immunity. For those who are not very familiar, the multilateral development banks are international organizations. They are constituted again by a treaty or an agreement signed by different countries. So therefore, they are, for the purpose of legal purposes, they are not considered like any national authority, or they are not considered like a private company. They have a specific status that gives what is called privileges immunities. Among them, the impossibility to make them liable for their own development of their own activities. This has been challenged, and in particular has been challenged in the context with the argument that what they do in the end of the day is a commercial activity. When they give a loan, when not so much maybe in the public sector lending, but definitely in the private sector lending, that when we give a loan to a private company to perform certain activity, that is a commercial activity, and therefore that should be subject to the same jurisdictional arrangement that each country has, and the United States has a very ample, very broad jurisdiction for this sense. So that's why they were challenging those jurisdictions instead of others. So it's a very complex topic. The long story makes short that the typical answer is the president, at least in the United States, is clear that these claims were rejected. The main argument had been that what the MDBs done, as long as it's reasonable within the scope of their own function, is not a commercial activity. It's not considered like that. Therefore, the court and the appeal court that deal with this matter in the United States say no, you cannot sue them, and we are not even entered. There was a lot of challenges about how the investigation had been conducted, what kind of due process has been followed. The court said, I'm not even going there because that would mean that I'm already reviewed this activity. I'm not going to review it. I know already, I have been told in conversations with companies, one very recently, that we are investigating, that we are going to challenge in the court because the court say this but didn't look into that. So it's a threat that we will keep on coming. We will face new challenges. People will read.
You need to conclude, please.
But yeah, that's, and the other one, the one related to, I don't know if you...
Law enforcement?
We work with law enforcement a lot, but I don't...
Yes, in terms of law enforcement, Andreas, so you will know that obviously we're administrative investigators and we gather evidence on the civil balance of proof. Law enforcement does not. They have, and so consequently they have greater powers as well, particularly coercive powers, which is where this confluence is an interesting sort of domain. We within the World Bank, I think, are more proactive than probably our partners in some of the other MDBs in doing referrals to law enforcement. And to me, that goes back to the point that I was just making. This is critical because, and this is why we're here for this week, is we're talking about making concerted efforts in a collegiate way to actually tackle corruption. We can do the supply side all day. That's not a problem. It's the demand side, because there is usually somewhere, there's a powerful politician somewhere or somebody connected to political with political connections who are extorting the bribes. It is a symbiotic relationship, but that is where our jurisdiction stops. And for us to be effective, the referral to law enforcement and working with good law enforcement, respecting the privileges and immunities, which is a really important part of the conversation, to me is really important. So we now this year will probably be close to issuing 20 referral reports, working with the French, the DOJ, the Serious Fraud Office, but also many jurisdictions in Africa and Latin America where we have memorandums of understanding. So it doesn't mean we hand over our entire file, because there are issues, there are P&I issues, privilege and immunities issues, but we do work increasingly with law enforcement.
Thank you, Alan. Just to say that at African Development Bank, we also do referrals to the national anti-corruption agencies. So Monique will have to leave. I would like to give her the opportunity to give her conclusion words, please, before we proceed. So Monique, the floor is yours.
Apologies that we have to catch a flight out because I'm being grilled tomorrow with Michael in our audit committee, and so we cannot influence their agenda. We have to be there and back in Luxembourg tonight. But I would like to say that I found this what I heard from everybody here and our colleagues in other institutions very enriching. Both on the preventative side, but also on the enforcement side. And indeed, it's not easy. The work is not easy, but it's very important. And maybe the conclusion is indeed that law enforcement is not our job. And I think that's why I also stressed in terms of working with Ukrainians, we have to make sure that Ukrainians can do that themselves, right? But that we can highlight and we can cooperate with them and transfer the knowledge. But thank you very much, Paula, for inviting me to this event. And I would like to say goodbye to everybody and see you next time.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Monique. Thank you very much. So I think that we can continue with the questions. Please indicate if you have a question, and let us be brief because we have 6 minutes.
Yes, I
Please.
will be quick and hopefully a useful comment, not a question, to complement the discussion.
Yes.
My name is Andrew Mendoza. I'm from the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank in Beijing. I think our approach to crisis and corruption are intertwined, anti-corruption. And I say this because during crisis, we opened a crisis recovery facility that allowed us to disperse and process projects very quickly. Part of that process is co-financing with the World Bank and AfDB. Now, I speak about harmonizing a lot about investigations and sanctions that allowed us to process these projects very quickly while ensuring that the standards from our perspective are still maintained. I just wanted to highlight that cooperation is important at that level so that we can process and address the requirements of our members fairly fast during crisis and emergency situations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. We will take a last question. Yes, here.
Oh, it's a lady here.
So this lady here.
Yeah,
Oh,
this lady.
here it was first.
I think
Sorry.
that lady was first.
Was
though.
first, yes. Sorry.
Hi, I'm sorry about that. Vedika, I'm with the OECD. I specifically work on development cooperation, and I have a quick comment and a question. I think the comment is that we can't have a catch-all definition of emergency because a fragile context is not the same as conflict affected, which is not the same as a natural calamity or a pandemic. So I think that nuance needs to be made, but that's probably a whole box of worms that we can't get into right now. And the question is more about, I think corruption risk management in conflict-affected situations is beyond just a law and order issue, right? It's a complex system where social norms and political realities are deeply entrenched. Often you have to make trade-offs between tolerating some degree of corruption and stability. So I'm wondering how that complexity is integrated in your corruption risk management approaches. This is to any panelist who wants to take it. Thank you.
Any panelists who wants to take the
I
question?
didn't quite get the question.
So your question, can you repeat your question for us to be sure that we understood?
My question is, it's beyond a law and order issue, so how do you integrate the social norm aspect of it and the political economy and cultural realities of where you're operating?
Yeah.
Tough one.
I'm happy to speak. I mean, I think we probably would all agree. I think we agree with you. I mean, just on the term of definition, you're spot on. When we were trying to do some analysis to work with other parts of the World Bank on what the risks were in these environments, trying to define precisely what an emergency operation was is already a challenge. So you're absolutely right, and it's a very fluid definition that we have to deploy across the bank with ever-changing sort of the reality. So you're absolutely right. Even just the nomenclature around some of these issues is difficult to pinpoint down. I mean, it's the inevitable sort of analogy about the duck. I mean, we have some idea of what an emergency situation is, but actually, you're right. Definitionally, that's really a challenge. And to the second point, and you asked an excellent question, very similar question yesterday of one of the other panels around tolerance on corruption. I mean, this is the law enforcement part, if you want to call us that, of our respective MDBs. But as I said at the outset, we also have some very nuanced work that's done on prevention. We share all of our intelligence, which is not done routinely anywhere else, with the prevention team that sit within INT. They see the same complaints that the investigators do, and they take a different context out of it, a different perspective, and they will work with the risk that they see immediately, in real time, rather than waiting 2 or 3 years for one of these investigations to conclude. That, in addition to the work that the governance practice does in the World Bank, supporting institutions, the work that different parts of the World Bank is doing, that's, in terms of its totality, that's how we try and address the many different complex areas that you've said. But unfortunately for you, you have the law enforcement people here today, but I can guarantee you work very, very closely, particularly on lessons learned from these huge amounts of work that is done within INT, certainly, to share them as quickly as we can across the institution to mitigate risk. As I said at the outset, this for us is all about risk.
Thank you very much, Alan. And we have the last question here, please.
Thanks very much. Barbara Schreiner here from the Water Integrity Network. And my question is to the ADB. Because I understand, and it may be true of the other banks as well, but you have something called contingent disaster funding, which, as I understand it, is set up in advance, and there are certain criteria that are met, certain conditions are met, and then the disaster funding can kick in very fast. My question is whether that changes the corruption risk profile in any way. Does it enable you to get your ducks in a row? Sorry, if you know what a duck is. Does it enable you to get your ducks in a row to some extent in advance, or is it actually completely irrelevant in relation to managing corruption risk?
Very good question. I think the contingent disaster facility is actually very much about setting up systems in advance. So definitely it's a risk mitigation factor. Because if you have the protocols, procedures for delivering aid, delivering assistance, having the relevant agencies trained, that is a huge risk mitigation in terms of making sure that the goods supplied are meeting standards, that they reach the right people, and that there's no unnecessary payments being siphoned off. So definitely that is a very important element of it.
Thank you very much, John. Sorry, I think I'm really losing my voice. So I think that now I will allow each panelist to do conclusion. One sentence. One sentence. Because I'm certain that a big sentence, right? So we are very generous. A big sentence.
A big sentence. So the challenges are significant. They're not getting any easier with the current environment that we find ourselves in. We continue to do our best. And I will disagree with Marco here. We are utilizing technology to assist us with the complexity of the picture, with the evolving complexity of the picture that we're facing.
Thank you, Alan.
Okay.
Marco.
Just one clarification, I have nothing against technology. I'm just saying that there's a lot of noise and a lot of things that sometimes are overhyped, but no, I truly believe I am. No, I think that my take, I think is a commonality that we hear here, and some of the questions came too, is working together, collaboration. The environment, especially in emergency crisis, etc., again, investigation is always challenging, but in those environments, it's even more challenging. The resources are even more scarce. So anyone who can contribute something is helpful. And sometimes what over the years, we are way better now, but over the years what has been happening is a lot of us institutions will be working on the same place, in the same, not talking to each other, not knowing, and we were just a few blocks one from the other, and we could have helped each other, and nobody had. We are trying to change that. Our offices, for sure, since many years, as Alan said, have been working together with that, and that's my take. We need to find ways to work together. There are a lot of legal limitations, a lot of things, but we need to find ways to, as clear as we can do it together, because the challenges are, the demand is increasing, the challenges are increasing too, and the need is increasing, so we need to find ways to do this together. None of us can do it alone.
Thank you, Marco. John.
Okay, I think I'm going to end on a positive note here, is that despite all the challenges, you know, sometimes there's real evidence that things are working. And I think the most important one that I've seen is in the major earthquake in Nepal in 2015. A lot of schools were destroyed, 8,000 plus, but not a single one of the ADB financed school with ADB specifications. So, things do work.
Thank you, John. And thank you very much to you, all of you. Thank you to the audience. It was a very engaging session. For me, I would say that the conclusion of this session is that in emergency situations is not whether we should or not engage, is how we should engage. I would like to thank Catalina and Dominic from the European Investment Bank. I would like to thank the organizers, the panelists, the audience, and thank you for the opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pablo.